Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. After all the chaos of his first term, denial of the election results, January the 6th, not to mention all the court cases against him, Donald Trump is the favourite to win the US presidential election. How is he doing it? To help us answer that question, we're joined today by a regular guest and veteran analyst of many, many US presidential elections, Professor Tom Baldino. Hello and welcome, Tom.
Hello, Nicholas.
Yeah, great to have you with us. I'm going to add, you've just literally written the book about this. Well, you've written the book about Pennsylvanian politics, and we're going to focus on that in a bit. And I'm going to share your book here. If we can just bring it up here. Here it is.
Thank you.
There we go. Pennsylvania Government and Politics, Understanding Public Policy in the Keystone State. Well, that's a pretty far-reaching book, actually. It goes back right to the beginnings of the state as well, doesn't it, Tom?
Yes. Yeah, there's an opening chapter on Pennsylvania political history. And then using that as a foundation, we look at all of the major institutions, parties, interest groups, and the like, and then try to weave all that together with interviews, over 60 interviews with contemporary political leaders, as well as governors, Supreme Court justices, all kinds of folks who enrich the text.
Okay. Well, it's for those who want it, it's there and available online. It's not too cheap, though. I've just had a look at it. It's about
by our standards, it is. It's only about $35.
Right. Okay. Anyway, so listen, let's jump in straight away. I think it's no secret that the opinion polls are showing. We've seen numerous polls. And the caveat is, at this stage, polls, anything can change between now and then. But it is shocking that, as I said in the introduction, after all that's happened, this is currently the state of things. Trump really does seem to have the upper hand over Joe Biden. This is the New York Times Siena poll. That's from late February. Tom, there have been plenty of others, haven't there?
Oh, yes. And depending on the state, clearly Biden is ahead in a place like California or New York. And actually in Pennsylvania, which Biden carried by 80,000 votes in 2020, they're neck and neck. Biden has a 1-point lead in the polls, but that's well within the margin of error, statistical margin of error. So Trump right now looks like he has the upper hand. But as I always told my students, a poll is merely a snapshot in time. Things can change and do. And when a poll occurs this far out from the election, when voters aren't confronted with the actual choice and the reality of choosing between candidate A and B, they're not fully invested in that decision yet. They're basing their decision in a poll or in deciding on answering a question in a poll on their emotions at that moment, rather than and speculating about what they might do. So I'm not terribly depressed. If I were Biden, I wouldn't be terribly depressed. Unhappy, perhaps, but not depressed about where he stands in the polls right now.
Right. Okay. I mean, the other thing that I found shocking is that the U.S. economy is doing really well. I mean, if you look by every single measure, unemployment way down, stock market back up again. Inflation is still there, but it's certainly falling. Americans have got more money. There's been real wage growth. By any economic measure, it would seem that he has done very well. But that's not what voters think.
No. And there is a rather famous, and I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head, measure that one particular historian actually uses to determine who's likely to win. And one of the primary elements of that measure is the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. This year, one would presume he would select Biden as the likely winner, but there is the perception of the economy, right? And as you noted, and in fact, I dug out a recent issue of The Economist, the U.S. Economic growth was 8% last year. The EU's was 3%. Japan was 1%, and Britain was 0%, right? So Americans aren't getting the message that we are doing well, not perfect, but we're well. And so a good deal of that is tempered by how the media, I think, how the media covers the economy. When the media focuses on the pocketbook issues, people go to the supermarket and they pick up a loaf of bread that now costs 50 cents more this week than it did last week. That's not the best example, but those kinds of things are what people remember, and that's what they associate with the economy. Most people don't associate the economy with the stock market, which is doing really well right now, right? And in his State of the Union, Biden referenced, he said candy bar, but there was an article in the New York Times written by an economist that referenced Snickers, the Snickers bar, as a way of understanding how people perceive the economy, which is it's an impulse buy, and people like Snickers. But if you go in and you're shopping, as you leave, there are the candy bars. And that Snickers bar that once cost only 50 cents, of course, it's increased, but it's gone up like 25% within the last few months because of cocoa prices and sugar prices. And people remember that. And you could also use the same thing with gasoline, petrol. And it took another 10-cent jump here just within the last few days in my area, right?
Developing this theme a little further and going back to the New York Times again, there's this poll here. If I can try and find it, hang on a second. That's the wrong one. I'll just try and come back to the right one if I can. Yeah, it's this one here. It's looking back. It's a sort of retrospective view of how Trump did as president compared to Biden. And this one here is about whose policies were better. And we know that there was COVID. The economy had a really tough time. Yes. And as we said already, the economy is doing very well now. And it seems like there's a sort of cognitive dissonance. People have reinterpreted things.
Yes. And Biden has been struggling with this. I gather, again, reading the New York Times and the Washington Post, how his people are feeling heat from Biden to change this narrative. Why is it that he gets no credit for the stimulus checks that went out under him? He pushed through the Environmental Act that actually is more of a spending bill for highway construction. He awarded grants yesterday for computer chip construction in Arizona. I mean, these things that were in that bill that were designed to stimulate the economy by adding jobs, by keying into key sectors of the economy that will produce things that we need now and in the future, like computer chips. But people don't give him the credit that he deserves for those things. So part of it is the salesmanship of his people, his team. And I also think that Trump, by the nature of who he is, drowns out good news. He makes an outrageous statement. It doesn't matter what good news there is that day. When he says that you're evil if you're Jewish and you don't believe in Israel and you hate yourself or whatever, because you would think about voting for a Democrat. I mean, that it's as crazy as it sounds. It monopolized a good chunk of the news cycle here, right? So it's incredible.
We were discussing this earlier, and I think it's, in trying to understand this question, you come down to character. And I mean, I'll share this one briefly, and I think we all know this one. Although Trump is 78, 77, Biden's 81, clearly everyone sees Trump as the more youthful, more vigorous candidate. And that's what we were discussing earlier. He's able to dominate the news headlines, but he's there all the time making big, outlandish statements. And you see this effect, and we were talking about this earlier, particularly among both the Latino population and the Black population. So tell us a bit about that, and men we're talking about.
Yes, predominantly, or essentially, when we talk about Trump's inroads within Black and Latino voters, we're looking at mostly among men. Now, there are some women, but mostly men. And for African Americans, his appeal is as a strong male figure, right? And Biden doesn't come doesn't come across as a strong enough male figure, right? And with Latino voters, especially those who've come from left-wing countries, they see Trump as a right-wing, authoritarian, strong leader. And it's the exact opposite of what they fled. So they're willing to trade a right-wing dictator for a potential or what they see as a left-wing dictator. Right? Painting Biden as a dictator is a stretch for me, but it's very effective for Trump, and he gets reinforced on Fox News, One American News, and those platforms, and on X and whatever the other social media platforms. So,
but for black male voters, because that's the one that was surprising for me. Blacks vote for the Democratic Party by and large. They have their interests at heart in terms of support, income support. If you let any social measures, taxation, yet that doesn't seem to work.
Well, here's the thing. Again, we're talking about black men, but we're not talking about a large number of black men, right? Overwhelmingly, blacks will vote for Trump or for Biden. And any erosion from the 88 or so percent that voted for Biden in the last election, if African Americans in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia peel away in just small numbers, given the size of the small size of Biden's victory in those states, 10,000 to 20,000 votes here or there could cost Biden the election. And that's where the concern is. Biden really can't afford to lose that many either African American males or Latino males, right?
Yeah, so it's margins that matter, and with that, I think we should also talk. And in a second, we're going to come to issues I think that are advantageous to the Democrats and to Biden in particular. But before we come on to that, let's still talk about the negatives. Foreign policy is not usually a big issue in an election. Generally, it isn't. But the Gaza war is definitely having an impact.
Yes, and it's hurting Biden, right? Biden has been a rock solid in support of Israel for almost his entire political career. And yet he supported Netanyahu after the attack on Israel and Netanyahu's response. But as Netanyahu pursues a very aggressive campaign in Gaza and more innocent civilians have died, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has come out strongly, as you've been following, against Netanyahu. And too many Americans want to play this as if you oppose Netanyahu, you oppose Israel. When in fact, one can support Israel and oppose its administration, in this case, Netanyahu. But Biden is having a difficult time separating his support of Israel from his weakening of support for Netanyahu. I mean, he's been on the phone with him. We read these reports that he has been tough with Netanyahu to, one, ease up on his assaults, and second, embrace a two-state solution, which wouldn't necessarily end that war, but which would give certainly the American left something to latch onto to say, well, here's something that we can help Israel achieve. Right.
So you can see that playing out in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia in particular has got a strong progressive element to it. John Fetterman, the senator, very pro-Israel, making very strong statements about that and coming for a lot of flack there. But I mean, so you can see how that could matter in Pennsylvania, another key battleground state. But there's nowhere where it's more critical than in Michigan, where you've got a substantial Arab American population there.
The largest in the country by most measures, yes. And they have come out in support of the innocent Palestinians who were suffering. No one there supports Hamas, or at least I haven't heard anyone say, go Hamas, right? But they are very sympathetic to the plight of the civilians who are literally right now starving. And so the there are well, as we saw in the primary in Michigan, the protest vote, none of the above basically did pretty well. It was an embarrassment for Biden, but it's the question then is, will those, if nothing else changes, will those people who pulled the none of the above or touch that button, will they fall in line behind Biden or will they stay home? Staying home is essentially a vote for Trump. Again, because of the narrow margin. If they vote for Trump, then it then gives that state to Trump.
Sticking with Michigan, I mean, Hillary Clinton won it by, Trump won it by 10,000 votes, I think, back in 2016, or a very small amount.
Very, very narrow. Very narrow.
And Biden won it by 150. But if you had, that number, tens of thousands of people abstaining, the Democrats would be in real trouble. This raises a particular issue. I mean, the polls here are about they look at people who say they're going to vote, but the real issue for both parties is the number of people who might not vote.
Yes, right. Getting those people, and there really aren't that many independent, absolutely uncommitted voters at this point. If you look at the polls, if you look at voter registration, for example, in Pennsylvania, that number right now in Pennsylvania is about, 15% registered as independent. We know from polls that have been done, most of those, or I should say, many of them lean one way or the other. More of them lean Republican than Democratic. So of those who remain independent and are independent, it's only about 5%, right? So when we think about how you get those people who are unsure if they're going to vote at all to the polls, those independents, one of the reasons that people register as independent is because they really aren't that fully committed to one party or the other. And if they're not committed to a party, they're less likely to vote. So if 15% of the public, 15% of registered voters stay home, that's a chunk. And if, as I said, more of them lean Republican, that actually could help Biden, but that would require all of those who are registered to Democrat to also vote. And again, because we know from the statistics and behavior over time, a substantial part of the Democratic base, African Americans, poor income, lower income voters, and statistically, they are less inclined to vote in most elections. Now, it starts at the top at the presidential election. So people are more likely to vote in a presidential election than an off-year congressional election, than in a local election. So maximum turnout will occur in a presidential election year. That being said, getting those independent voters to the polls will be the task of both parties. They want to mobilize their base, and especially their weak supporters, but trying to get those people who are independent to the polls and voting for your party, that's the key. And so I expect that we'll see a lot more money spent, not just on advertising. This money, there's going to be so much more money in this election, but get out the vote, right? Voter mobilization efforts. And the Democrats traditionally lean heavily on union members to help that. And with activist groups like pro-abortion, reproductive rights groups, Emily's List, those kinds of folks to help get the vote out. And so there's going to be a lot of money spent there, and try to drive your numbers up for both parties, in particular for Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious thing to say is in the American system, normally has that razzmatazz. Politics is a jamboree, really. Seen from abroad. But the moment it's the Republicans who have all the noise, and not the Democrats. I'd love to get some questions in early. People, I know we've got people in the US, the UK, Australia watching. and I'd love to get your questions in as soon as we can. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and then we can go to Tom. Let's deal with a few issues that at least favor the Democrats. Since the Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade, that shift has moved to the debate about access to reproductive rights has shifted to the state levels, because that's essentially what the court decided. Let's talk about Arizona, for example, and how does this kind of thing play out? I mean, I know it's not, there's the Arizona abortion ban, but this has been put, the issue has been put up for discussion at the state level and become a really contentious issue across many states.
Well, right. Interestingly, when the question of the constitutional right to abortion has been placed before the voters, even in red states, that right has been upheld, or at least been institutionalized. So it's an opportunity for Democrats to mobilize women to support Biden and their candidates down ballot. Democrats, if they have any hope, they need to if not hold on to the Senate, at least keep the losses to a minimum and maybe regain the House. And one way to do that is to get more women out to the polls, or at least get them enthusiastic, not just to go vote, but to get maybe people who wouldn't have voted to the polls. And in Arizona, which I try to follow as best I can, there's a polarizing figure running again, and that's Carrie Lake, right? And people, I do have relatives who live in Arizona, and I hear from him regularly. And she is a very polarizing figure, and people will turn out to vote against her. And if they stay in the voting booth to vote either up or down below her, she will pull Democrats to vote, or voters to vote for Democratic candidates. If the Democrats are successful in linking all of the Republicans to a anti-abortion position. And it's not just abortion, right? It's this IVF, in vitro fertilization, because of the Alabama court decision. And the Supreme Court's going to hear a case very soon dealing with mifepristone, right? The drug that induces abortion, and whether the FDA improperly has regulated that. And God help the Republican Party if the Supreme Court strikes down the FDA's ability to classify mifepristone as a drug that can be prescribed and mailed out to people. That, because the next step after that would be, let's go after contraception.
Yeah.
And the availability of the drugs that are available for that.
But here's the issue: is that this is a rallying factor in an election where states could be won by a few points. Yes. This could be critical. And I was looking at and we're talking about Arizona there. They had a 15-week abortion ban, but they're now trying to institute a restrictive law dating back to the 1800s that effectively bans the procedure entirely. And obviously, the Democrats are outraged, but quietly, they see this as a boon that could inspire voters to turn out in November.
Yes. And this is, somebody described it as the dog that caught the car, right? If you've been chasing after this thing that you've wanted all along and you finally get it, what do you do with it? In this case, the conservative Republicans who wanted an abortion ban got it from the court in the Dodd decision, and now there's this backlash. Yeah. But unfortunately for the Republicans, there are other issues like immigration and the economy that could balance out the enthusiasm for Democratic women on the reproductive rights issue.
Okay, let's take some questions. I've got still many more myself, and we're going to talk about foreign policy and how that affects things, and just the sort of existential nature of this election. I think that both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, frame it as, and also I think we outside the United States see it as well. So, but Marty Ryan's got a very fundamental question. I've got some views on this, but go ahead, Marty.
Well, I don't want this question to sound really naive. I'm in Connecticut. And I'm reading Liz Cheney's book right now, and I was in the audience with her on last Thursday. And I hear you talking about how Black men see Trump as a strong man, I know about the Christian nationalists and their view, but what I'd really like to hear from you is your views on what it is about Trump and his lies and his threat to our democracy that appeals to people.
Oh my. So to unpack that could take another hour, but as briefly as I can, you can trace the effectiveness of what Trump is doing back to, I hate to do this, to Adolf Hitler and people before him. If you tell a big lie and you repeat it over and over again, it sounds like the truth and people just accept it. And then in this instance, Trump, or I should say Hitler, didn't have a Fox News or a One American News or all the talking conservative radio hosts, or rephrase that, all the radio hosts who are conservative, basically amplifying and adding on to the lies that Trump tells. Okay. And then you have the mainstream press, which has for the longest time been reluctant to say that's a lie, right? And instead play this, play at attempting to be fair, right? Oh, well, Trump says that, Biden says that. See, they're both lying, that false equivalency kind of thing. And it helps to basically allow Trump to be perceived as not lying. Clearly, he exaggerates, but he gets away with it. And among his base supporters, many of them will tell you he just exaggerates. We really don't believe everything he says, but we like what he did. And he gave the country a conservative Supreme Court. He started building a wall. Things like that. Now, do they look back and think about the quality of the economy under his administration? They should, but what they see are, oh, it was better than it is now because inflation didn't hit 9% under Trump. It wasn't great, but it would, went up under Biden. It's coming down now. More jobs have been created under Biden than under Trump, but that's not what they remember. So,
my experience, we were in Iowa, and it's not the first time we've seen Trump, operate. We were there at one of his rallies. We did the same again 4 years ago, and we've been to another one of his rallies, I think in Virginia. There are a couple of things. People said in 2016, or was it? That the Democrats or people like me took Trump literally, but not seriously.
Right.
And then his supporters took him seriously, but not literally. So that explains one twist. But the other thing that sort of comes to mind is that he's an incredibly effective negative communicator. He enables people to give them a reason why they dislike their grievances. He gives voice to their grievances in a way that I don't think other politicians can do as a populist. And that's incredibly effective in these times. If you look at YouTube, if you look at X or Twitter, it's about negative messaging. And that seems to have a much deeper emotional impact on voters than anything else.
Oh, absolutely. And when you hear Republicans, or just not just some Republicans, but analysts talk about Trump and compare him to Reagan, I mean, the quality of their messaging was entirely different. Reagan was sunshine, happiness, the shining city on the hill, and Trump is America is going down the toilet, and this is a horrible place, and only he can rescue us, right? From when he first announced, I knew immediately that if this man went further, he would weaken America's civil discourse, and he didn't just weaken it; he's completely destroyed it. Having a civil conversation about policy anymore, it quickly degenerates into name calling.
But and that's the other thing, is that a policy doesn't matter. We went to a rally, we saw Nikki Haley at a rally. We had to get up a very snowy lane in freezing Iowa with cars spinning off the road. And then once we got there, I mean, she's she makes an attractive candidate. She's and she's positive, and she talks about family. She's a great personal story, but she was also talking about policy. And then I thought, you've lost it already. As soon as you start talking about policy, nobody cares, because it's about gut instinct. And Trump can whip people up in a way that no other Republican can.
So let me just throw in the two things there that come to mind. One, the immigration bill that was negotiated in the Senate, bipartisan, that Republicans initially liked, and then Trump comes in and says, no, right? Bipartisanship goes out the window. And as a policy issue, it's still out there, but it really helps Republicans. And then the fact that so much of American politics is divided in a way that it's not over policy. Political scientists call it affective polarization. It's emotional polarization. We don't just differ with the other side over positions on immigration, but we hate the other side. We demonize the other side. So that no matter what comes out of the other side's mouth, it's wrong, it's evil, it's, so how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah.
We are at a crossroads here.
Yeah, the difficult crossroads. We're going to come to that, some of those, how critical this election might be, and this comes back to what Marty was suggesting as well in just a moment. But let's take a more technical question from Diane Cook. Go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, perhaps I'm going to introduce a Deus ex machina here. What happens, and this has been something I've been thinking about over the last few weeks, what happens if a candidate is selected and then they die or they're declared legally incapacitated before the election? And more sensationally, what happens if either of those events happen when their names are on the ballot paper?
Okay, so there is no constitutional prescriptions here, or proscriptions, either way, for what you're describing. What comes into play are party rules, national party rules. And depending upon when the candidate who has been identified by the party, so I'm going to assume that we have the conventions, and both parties' conventions officially nominate Biden and Trump. At that point, should either a candidate die or become totally incapacitated, then the party selects the candidate to replace that person. There wouldn't be another convention. The party gets to determine, by whatever means it chooses, who the next candidate would be. If you have, and by that point, by the way, the ballots were probably printed. If something were to happen and the candidates we have the election and the candidate dies, actually, that would be determined by so elections held, that would be determined by the Congress, okay? Because, well, let me back up. Then if the election is held, then and one candidate wins, then the vice presidential candidate would step up, but not until the candidate is sworn in. And then we'd go through the constitutional process of having the new president, who was the vice presidential candidate, nominate someone to be the vice president, and that would have to get a vote from both houses of Congress. But that whole process between the time of the convention and the election, that's all in the hands of party officials. They get to pick the candidate.
Golly, wow, yeah, and I mean, it's
not exactly democratic.
No, democratic at all. Let's. I mean, that's a sort of a red herring. But let's bring some others into the equation. Third parties, Thomas. What happens? What's their impact on the election? And maybe can you just mention a few of them, and do they matter? Who are the possible third candidates?
Well, so right now the most prominent third party candidate is Robert Kennedy Jr., right? Bobby Kennedy's oldest, one of his sons, I think it's his oldest son. He is he got his start as a expert in environmental policy, very much pro-environment. But more recently, he's been an anti-vaxxer, right? He opposed all kinds of vaccines, and then COVID happened, and he absolutely opposed COVID vaccines. So he's become this champion of libertarians and now more conservative voters who hated Biden for and any Democratic governor who imposed COVID lockdowns, who encouraged vaccines. So he's out there, and Democrats worry because of the name Kennedy, he will attract voters from Democrats or attract voters away from Biden. He hasn't announced his vice presidential candidate. But two names, you may have seen this, two names that he's floated are the former governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, the former WWF, World Federation wrestler, and the other is a American football player named Aaron Rodgers. Of the two, at least Jesse Ventura has some governmental experience. Aaron Rodgers was a very good quarterback, but no political experience to speak of, and very, very conservative. I would characterize him as a Neanderthal conservative, right? Kind of a gut level, I'm opposed to government, I'm opposed to this, I'm opposed to just that kind of a person. But there's a woman her name slipped out, a rather young lawyer in California who is conservative, but not as alienating to some voters as either Ventura or this Aaron Rodgers person would be. And her name is now floating out there. So a ticket of Kennedy and somebody like that definitely appeal to more Democrats. That's my opinion. If he were to pick Jesse Ventura or Aaron Rodgers, the chances of him pulling some Republican voters is also there. Now, the other group is a group called No Labels. And it was initially formed by disaffected Democrats and Republicans to create a third party that would kind of draw the middle voters who feel disaffected from both Biden and Trump. And they were scouting out candidates. They initially supposedly made offers to Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, who's announced that he's not seeking re-election. And then he said, I'm not interested in No Labels. They approached Joe Lieberman, but Joe Lieberman is on the board, and he said no. Joe Lieberman, former senator from Connecticut, and they approached the former governor of Maryland, who's now running for the Senate seat in Maryland, Hogan. He said no. So they're floundering for a candidate.
Yeah, but sorry, just to cut in there, Tom. I mean, does this really matter? I mean, yes. Okay, if Kennedy gets somebody else who's very attractive, maybe that's a percentage point in one crucial state or another.
Yes.
So at this stage, it's hard to tell. So it's a known unknown.
All right. So I'm sorry. I should tighten this up. So the key here is, of any of these third parties, and there are a couple of others out there, do they weaken either candidate enough so that Trump or Biden wins the state as a consequence? Or, in my mind, the worst case scenario, they weaken candidates in enough states so that neither Biden or Trump wins the Electoral College, in which case it goes to the House of Representatives, which right now has a Republican majority by 2 seats. And the states vote not by individual members, but they vote as a state. So the delegation comes together, decides how to cast its one vote. And right now, Trump would win because Republicans control more state nominations.
Yeah. Okay, Audrey Wolf, lovely question here, and then we'll take Hillary Matthews after that. So Audrey, go ahead. No, there you go. Go ahead, Audrey.
I'm asking what is going to happen when the public really realizes that Trump is not a billionaire, cannot pay these fines, could be incarcerated because of it if he was treated like anybody else. But the revelation of what he does not have is probably the most massive thing that's happened to him since he started to run. Is that not true? And how would that affect in the long run?
Is it going to change anyone's mind, Tom? I don't see that happening. Me and Audrey, we always disagree on these matters. Tom, I can't see it changing anyone's minds.
No, unfortunately, I don't. I think he will play the victim, that it's the liberal judges, it's the liberal banks that have denied him the opportunity to come up with the funds that he needs to pay off or secure his bond in this matter. And don't rule out Elon Musk. Elon Musk could easily write him a check for $400, $500, $600 million, and he's whole again, right? And then there's the darkest of me, which thinks, maybe Putin will bail him out. Now, it won't be a check from Putin, but it'll be one of his oligarchs or whatever will come along and give him a couple $100 million. Nothing there would surprise me, and his supporters will be just fine with that.
Yeah.
While
we're there, I mean, we've mentioned Putin, and this guy, I hate coming back to my Iowa experience, but it is very relevant. We were in a bowling alley. We were snowed in Denison, Iowa, and there was a small group of, I think Republicans who'd done reasonably well. They were quite affluent. They're doing quite well, and they were all going to vote for Trump. And the one thing I said to them at the end of the evening, I said, look, for us, this is existential. We're very worried about Ukraine. We're very worried about Russia. And if Trump is not there to support Ukraine, which he's clearly not, there's a country's going to fall. And the repercussions for Europe, the repercussions for democracies around the world is colossal. But this doesn't really matter in a US presidential election, does it? It's an existential thing for us, but is it for Republicans who are voting for him?
I would say it's not. And for two reasons. One, part of Trump's, if you want to call it a political philosophy, is America first, which really is America alone. America is an isolation, going back to isolationism. And second, Trump has managed to sell a brand of Christian nationalism, which he doesn't really talk about as such. I mean, occasionally he'll use that phrase, but he can embrace someone like Putin or Orban as people who uphold Christian values. Because we all know that Putin is a God-fearing, church-going man, and he's anti-gay, he's anti-this, he's anti-that. All those things that liberal Democrats embrace, he rejects. I can use.
Well, he's authoritarian, and yes, that's what we like.
They want a strong leader, right? Yeah. So you're looking at people who want a strong leader who's also a Christian and a nationalist. Sure.
Yeah.
Putin,
and then when you flip that around, if you talk about something being existential, what's the existential crisis as far as they're concerned? It's not Putin, it's not the war in Ukraine, it's Biden.
It's a woke America, right? Driving, Biden is the authoritarian on the left who's pushing this incredibly liberal social agenda and who will spend America into oblivion, right? We just run up the debt.
Yeah. Okay, let's take some more questions. We've got Hillary Matthews. Please, everyone, do put some more questions down in the Q&A box. And if we don't get more soon, we will wrap up a bit earlier. But we've got some here coming now. So Hillary Matthews.
Yes, hi. I wonder if you have why do you think the Democrats have been unable to come up with a younger, dynamic candidate? And do you think that if such a person had appeared, Biden might have decided not to run again? And finally, with this, do you think that Kamala Harris has had a negative effect on the Democratic vote, as no one thinks she'd make a good president if Biden died or became incapacitated?
All right, let me take the last part of that first, because it's pretty straightforward. Harris hasn't really had an opportunity to display what she can do, and I think more recently, since she's been on the campaign trail pushing for reproductive rights, we may see more of Harris in a way that presents her in a flattering light, at least for Democrats, in a way that Biden's State of the Union address gave Democrats some hope that, he has a pulse, right? I described Biden in that speech as highly caffeinated. We need to see more of the caffeinated Biden, and we need to see more of the animated, passionate Kamala Harris. Okay, so now why not a younger candidate? Part of that is a function of Biden got into the race in 2020, if we can believe him, because Trump was the candidate. And the fact that Trump is back in the race and was in it essentially right after he lost in 2020, Biden feels the obligation to go at it again with Trump. Ego, clearly it's ego, but Biden feels he's the only one who can defeat Trump. And party loyalists, and they're party loyalists because they support the party and they're going to fall in line, and they have behind Biden. And so had Biden voluntarily stepped aside, we would have seen a younger candidate. Absolutely. Gretchen Whitmer, or there are other candidates out there who would have been more competitive in a way than Biden, right? Yeah. Interestingly, if Trump hadn't run and it was Nikki Haley or the Florida governor, whose name just is on the tip of my tongue,
Ron DeSantis,
right? That would be, if either of those folks or some other candidate were the candidate, Biden would have probably dropped out. That would be my guess. He would not have decided to run for re-election if
I'm going to with this. This has obviously been, in terms of this whole discussion, has been very critical of Biden and talked up Trump's prospects. But I will look at one conclusion from Super Tuesday, which is the biggest of primaries for both Democrats and Republicans held across many states. And just looking at some of the stats coming out of that, we saw more Republican primary voters voting against Trump than Democratic ones voting against Biden. So there are about 1 in 5 voters voted for another candidate or not at all, or going to cancel their paper, in Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio. And about 1/4 voted against him in Kansas. By contrast, Biden ceded close to 1 in 10 in most of the states holding primaries on that Tuesday. So that would, if the most important issue is getting out your base, it would seem the Republicans and not the Democrats have the problem.
Yes, but the problem for the Democrats is, will those Nikki Haley voters and Ron DeSantis voters stay home, or will they actually then turn around and vote for Trump? If they're not going to vote for Biden, the best thing for them to do from Biden's perspective is to stay home, right? Rather than vote for Trump. But we don't know. This is what we don't know. There have been some polls after the fact of Nikki Haley voters and asking them, and DeSantis voters asking them who they would vote for. Now, Haley has not endorsed anyone, right? DeSantis threw his support behind Trump, but they're kind of evenly split. The last one that I saw, the Haley voters are evenly split. Some are going to either stay home or vote for Biden, but the other half are going to vote for Trump. So yeah, those numbers of
I would say in Iowa, there's a lot of evidence of Democrats registering as Republicans in the 2 weeks before polling day and voting for Haley to, give her a better shot. So, I mean, that's an outrageous thing to say that many of her supporters were Democrats, but anecdotally, it did seem to me that they were.
And that was the case in New Hampshire, where you get to register, you get to decide in what party you're going to vote on the day of the primary. And Democrats voted in the Republican primary for Nikki Haley. And even if she didn't win, she did get a chunk of the vote. She got 40%.
Okay, we've got another question from Vaughan Grills. Vaughan, go ahead with your question. You need to open your microphone, which is probably on the bottom left-hand side of your computer, of your screen.
Okay, got it now. Thank you. Yeah, why isn't the age thing applied to Trump? I mean, he's only a couple of, 3 years younger than Biden, isn't he? Also, he appears at least as muddled.
And his dad had Alzheimer's, didn't he?
Indeed.
Very bad case of Alzheimer's. And we can see from Trump's interviews back in the 1990s, it was something he had real concerns about, Tom.
Yeah. I still struggle with why the age factor doesn't play as hard on Trump as it does on Biden. I think part of it is in Trump's rallies, he is an invigorating speaker and he can talk forever, whereas Biden
rubbish.
The State of the Union, where we saw an animated Joe Biden. In fact, not just this State of the Union, but the previous one, where he engaged in an exchange with Republicans that was very effective. And he did it in this most recent one. So if we saw a more animated Joe Biden, I think some of that may wear away. But at this point, I think it's baked in. It's unfortunate. The age thing hurts Biden more.
Yeah.
And maybe because he's grayer than Trump. I mean, Trump and his hair make him look a bit youthful.
Tom, in a second, I want to come back to your assessments about the threat, if you like, to American democracy. I think most of the people watching this will see this as an existential election, possibly for American democracy, but also the threats it has for the rest of the world. So bear that in mind while we take one more question from Marty Ryan. Go ahead with your question, Marty.
Have you heard any ideas about who Trump might choose as a vice presidential candidate?
Oh, there are all kinds of names out there. Elise Stefanik, representative of New York. She's the minority whip in the House. Kristi Noem, governor of
South Dakota.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which Dakota.
South Dakota.
Yeah.
She's just had her teeth done.
Tim Scott, right? Possibility. I mean, for Trump, the key thing is loyalty, and two, not being upstaged. You can look pretty as you stand beside him, which is why I think he was likely to go for an attractive woman. And second, you cannot challenge him. You cannot overshadow him. So someone who can maybe just look pretty and not take away any of the spotlight will be safe with that. And he'll likely
Carrie Lake was a no-go because she might try and challenge him or upstage him.
No, now she's running for office in Arizona again, so she's out of the picture. Unless if he were to go out and invite her, she'd probably take that. But I think he would rather have her win in Arizona. But he will make that announcement, I think, relatively soon. I think in the next month or so. Okay. Definitely before the convention.
Tom, let's turn to that big question then. What without being emotional about it, what do you see as the threat that Trump brings to the US if he is elected again? In the back of my mind, I've looked at the Heritage Foundation's proposals for his first 180 days in office, which is called Project 25, which talks about a whole scale change in the American leadership across the board. And that seems very worrying to me. What are the issues? What are you worried about if he comes back into office?
Project 2025, because it's a concrete plan to basically dismantle key elements of what I call the Roosevelt New Deal administrative state. Okay. So you have administrative agencies that do regulation. You have people who staff them who are appointed based on merit, not partisanship. You have unions that are protected because of the National Labor Relations Act. Okay. A lot of those things will be gutted. And what we now take for granted will be not taken for granted. I worry about more appointments to the federal bench, not necessarily the Supreme Court, although I worry about that, but the appellate and district courts, many more federal judges will be appointed. I worry about American isolationism. If we withdraw from the world, that opens it up for not just Putin, but for Xi and China, right? Whether or not Taiwan would be able to withstand on its own, which it probably wouldn't, an invasion by China. And then why stop at Taiwan? But yeah, and then there's the coarsening of American society, and not just the dialogue, but racism will, if the Klan comes back in its robes and marches in Washington after Trump is elected, I would not be surprised. The Proud Boys are already out there, maybe a bit lower profile these days, but these right-wing groups, the racist groups, they will be out there and proudly out there because Trump basically has.
When you meet the voters, the vast majority of people who are voting for Trump, they're not voting because of that. They just think the Democrats are a threat to their own values and that they want someone who backs them, somebody who's sort of in favor of white conservatives without being necessarily overtly racist about it.
Oh yeah, no, I know enough Trump voters who would say they're not racist, and I believe them, but they definitely are in favor of a strong leader who is not pushing and I'll use that word a woke ideology, right? A woke agenda. And they don't want the federal government spending any more money. They would prefer to see the federal government's role in the economy and in society significantly rolled back.
Okay, I am going to share this. I want to in case you don't know about Project 2025, I think it's worth highlighting, and you'll see lots of coverage of this in the US press. You'll see it in the Washington Post, the New York Times. There hasn't been much in the British press. I don't know about Australia too, but it's pushed by the Heritage Foundation, and it's got a very deliberate agenda to bring about a very wide-scale change across federal government at very senior levels in a way that no other administration has introduced it. So it's probably worth having a look at it if you haven't already.
Carlos Lozado in the New York Times wrote a lengthy piece summarizing a good bit of this. The Atlantic Monthly magazine a few months back devoted a whole issue to what a Trump second term would look like, and at least one of the articles, I think two, were devoted to Project 2025. So if you don't want to read it in its entirety on your own, try to find those other sources.
Yeah. Great. Well, listen, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. It's been a very good session, and I'm hoping that we can get to see you again in Pennsylvania in November 2025. We'll just have to watch this space. We've had a huge amount of interest in our US election tours. We're actually running 2 in Michigan and DC. And as things stand, I think we may be going back to Pennsylvania as well, which is another equally important battleground state. How many votes does it have in the Electoral College, Tom?
18.
18. So
it's actually 19, excuse me.
19, it's exactly the same as Michigan. They both got 19, so equally important there. Listen, great. Thank you very much indeed again for your time. Thanks very much.
Happy to be here. Bye, everyone.